Todd Dunn here on May 31st, 2022 at my 1972 Allied Princess Sequester. Today I want to talk about buying an old fiberglass boat, and today's video is going to be about the standing rigging, the masts and the wires that hold them up. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. Every mast, like this one, has spreaders. This is a single spreader rig, and there are wires that hold the mast up that come from the top of the mast down to a chain plate, and on a single spreader rig from the bottom of just underneath the spreaders down to chain plates. And depending on the complexity of the rig, there may be one or two of the lower wires on each side. Now this particular boat has cap shrouds, which are the ones that go up to the top of the mast, and two lowers on each side. So that's 6 wires at the center of the boat, and up at the forward end underneath that roller furler is the forestay, and then coming down from the top of the mast up there is the backstay, and which on a sloop would be a single wire. Since this is a ketch, it's split and comes down to 2 chain plates. So normally you're looking at a minimum of 6 wires. This boat has 8, and a double spreader rig will have additional wires going from the end of the lower spreader up to the bottom of the second spreader, and it is much more complex. Anyway, I want to talk about some of the details of masts and other aspects of the rig that you need to consider if you're buying an old fiberglass sailboat. So let's go inside and chat about it. All right, I'm aboard the boat now, and I want to talk a little bit about rigs. What does the rig consist of? Basically, it consists of 3 things. You have the mast, you have spreaders, which are short pieces of metal or wood that extend out perpendicular from the sides of the mast, and then there are the stays and shrouds. Stays go fore and aft, starting at the top of the mast, either going down to the bow, that's the forestay, or down to the stern, which is the backstay. Shrouds start somewhere on the sides of the mast, either at the top or partway down the mast at the spreaders, and they go outboard to the deck. The other thing you're going to see is where is the bottom of the mast, the foot of the mast. Well, there are 2 styles. You'll find what are called deck step masts, where the foot of the mast, in the case where it lands on top of a cabin house, ends at the top of the cabin house, and inside the boat there will be a substantial post that supports the point where the mast is stepped. Something like this, which is what you can see of a 6 by 6 inch oak post. And that's supporting that's supporting the weight of a deck stepped mast. The other option is what's called a keel stepped mast, where the mast goes right through the top of the cabin house and through a hole in the top of the cabin house, and it will be packed with some sort of seal there, and the penetration point through the top of the cabin house is called the partners, and the bottom of the mast, the foot of the mast, will be right down on the keel of the boat on a mast step down there, and it will be usually either fit into a keyed mast step or possibly set down into a metal mast step and bolted down in place. The reason for the 2 different styles of mast, deck stepped and keel stepped, is Deck step is of course cheaper. You don't have as long a spar. It could be anywhere from six to maybe even 8 or 9 feet shorter than a keel step mast for the same boat. Keel step mast though has a couple of advantages. In general, the mast is lighter and smaller dimensions with a keel step mast, so you'll tend to find keel step masts more on racing type boats, or boats that maybe were intended for racing. They aren't always used that way. And deck step masts tend to be on boats that are perhaps a little heavier and weren't intended for racing, because the section or the size of the mast in cross section will be bigger, and the mast will actually be heavier than a keel step mast. More weight up high will give you more heeling. Now, there's no reason to prefer one or the other. They both work just fine. You can go offshore with a deck step mast, no problem at all. You can go offshore with a keel step mast, same thing. You can race a boat with a deck step mast. They both rig styles work fine, but you will find that if you had two boats that were identical boats, and one had a deck step mast and one had a keel step mast, that for a given wind speed, for the same sail area, the deck step mast would heel a little bit more because the mast itself is heavier. And that's more weight up high, which causes a greater heeling moment. Okay, so that's the mast and the wires, the rig, the stays and shrouds. So why do you need to be concerned about this? The reason is pretty simple. Stays and shrouds in particular have a finite life. The actual effective lifetime of stays and shrouds depends a lot on how the boat is used and where it's used. If you're down in the tropics in a warm climate where the mast is up all year and the boat is sailed all year, and you might be considering going offshore, then people will say that a good life expectancy for the stays and shrouds is about 10 years, and that they should be replaced if they are 10 years or older. Now, if you're up here in Maine, where we take our masts down every year and have the opportunity with the mast down to do a very thorough inspection of our stays and shrouds and all the attachment points on the mast, and the boat is only used for 4, maybe 5 months at the outside, a year, the stays and shrouds will last a lot longer. It's also cooler here, so corrosion isn't as big a problem. That doesn't mean you don't need to inspect them carefully, but it's not unusual for a boat here in Maine to get 20 years out of stays and shrouds, or maybe even longer. Just depends on how the boat is used. Is it sailed hard? Is it just day sailed under light to moderate conditions? Are you planning to go offshore, etc.? But the point is, these components do need to be replaced, and if you're buying an old fiberglass sailboat, there's a good chance that the stays and shrouds could be pretty old, or depending on the type of boat you're buying, if it's been raced a lot, they may have been stressed pretty heavily, and you might want to consider replacing them right away, or at least maybe within a year. And if you're going offshore, you want to replace them for sure. So you want to look, that's going to be a cost that you have to factor in. Now on this boat, the mast is 40 feet high. This is a 36-foot boat. The mast is a little shorter than it would be on a sloop. I priced out new stays and shrouds for a DIY installation, in which I would measure the stays and shrouds myself and send the measurements off to a rigging company that will make the rigging up for me. There are quite a few of those around, and then send me back the constructed stays and shrouds, and I would then install them on the mast. And here in Maine, that's easy because the mast is taken down every year. It's sitting there on sawhorses. It's pretty easy to put new stays and shrouds on. If I did that for this boat, for the main mast only, remember this boat's a ketch, but we're not going to talk about the other mast because now that's the same thing. It's just one more mast to consider. But on this boat, it would cost about $2,800 to $2,900 to replace the standing rigging, that's the wires that hold the mast up, if I was buying this boat and wanted to be sure that the rigging was in good shape. So that's something you want to consider. Now, if you are not up to doing it yourself, you can probably at least double that for a boat this size. Say, $6,000 or more. So that can be a fairly substantial expense. Now, the other thing is, on a boat like this, where we have, if I was replacing the rigging on this boat, I would definitely replace the forestay and the backstay and the cap shrouds, the ones that go from the side of the boat up to the top of the mast. Now, the lower shrouds that go from just below the one set of spreaders on this mast down to the side of the boat are there to keep the mast straight, or as they say, in column, so it doesn't bend in the middle. And they are not as critical to keeping the mast up as the forestay, backstay, and cap shrouds. So those lower shrouds, you could wait on those a little bit if they looked to be in good shape. So that brings us to inspecting the rig. I mean, what you want to do when you inspect the rig is you want to check all the wires. The wires are what are called 1x19 wire. That means they have 19 strands of wire and that are twisted together to make up the wire. And you want to inspect the shrouds and stays full length to make sure that the wires are in good shape, there are no broken strands, and there's no obvious corrosion in the end fittings. Now, there are two types of end fittings. There are what are called swaged on end fittings, in which the wire fits into a stainless steel fitting, and then the stainless steel fitting is compressed by a swaging machine onto the wire. And that is probably the most common way that you'll have rigging made up, especially if you order it from a rigging company. The other way uses what are called mechanical end fittings. And a mechanical end fitting, basically, you take the end of the wire, you slide part of the end fitting onto the wire, and there's a little cone that you embed in the end of the wire, and then you screw the other part of the fitting into the part that you slid onto the wire, snug it up, and that compresses the wire around the cone and provides a good connection. Now, mechanical fittings are in many ways preferable because they can be taken apart and they can actually be reused. However, they are considerably more expensive than swaged fittings, even when you consider the labor to swage the fittings onto the wire. Mechanical fittings, though, can be installed by you. You need a hacksaw to cut the wire, and you need a couple of adjustable wrenches or appropriate size open end wrenches to install the fitting. So they're pretty simple to do, and you can do them yourself. And if you, for example, are going offshore, you might want to carry a little extra wire and a couple of mechanical fittings so that if you do have a shroud or a stay that is giving you problems, you can just make up a new one on the spot. Of course, that's extra money that you have to spend. So And which you use really is a function of how much money do you want to spend and how handy are you. Now, some people use a combination. They use a swaged fitting on top where water cannot accumulate into the fitting because the opening points down, and they use a mechanical fitting on the bottom because you can open that up and inspect it to see if there is corrosion. So what about inspecting the wire and the fittings? As I mentioned, you want to inspect the wire to make sure it's in good shape, no broken strands, because each strand that breaks loses a bit over 5% of the strength of the wire. And you break one, you're going to break another one, and then you're going to break two more, and so on. And it won't take long before the wire goes. And you also want to look at the end fittings to see just what they look like. What condition are they in? Ideally, what you'd like to do is clean them all up and then do what's called a dye penetration test, in which you use a dye that's in a solution and you paint it onto the fitting, and then you clean it off, and if there are any cracks in the fitting, the dye will penetrate the crack, and you will be able, when you look at that closely, you'll be able to see a line of a tiny crack that you might not have been able to see any other way. So that's something you want to really take a close look at when you're buying an old fiberglass sailboat. You also want to make sure that you can get information from the seller about how old the standing rigging is. Because, if it's only 4 or 5 years old, you're probably good to take that boat offshore after an inspection to make sure that everything is fine. Now, bear in mind, when you buy an old fiberglass sailboat, you're going to have the boat surveyed. You're going to need the survey to get insurance, so you'll do that. And it's also to give you an independent estimate of the condition of the boat. But most surveyors don't do much more than take a cursory look at the rig. They certainly aren't going to do dye penetration testing on the fittings, and other than just looking at it, they're probably not going to do much, particularly if the rig is up. They're just going to take a quick look and say, yes, the rig looks okay, or the fittings look old and they should be replaced. So you're not going to get a full comprehensive evaluation. If you want that, you either have to have the knowledge to do it yourself, or you have to hire a competent rigger to inspect the rig and tell you its condition. Now, a rigger can inspect the rig if the mast is off the boat or if the mast is on the boat. The rigger will go up the mast and inspect everything that way. So those are the main parts of a rig that you want to be aware of, and the shrouds and stays are the big thing that you want to look at the condition of. Now, the mast itself is something else you want to look at the condition of. You do not want to buy a boat if the mast looks like it is bent. A bent mast is weakened and really should be replaced. And that is going to cost you a lot of money to get an appropriate mast and have all new rigging made up for it and have it installed. You're probably looking at a cost to replace the mast on a sloop that's going to be approaching the cost of repowering the boat, say $20,000 or so. So you want to make sure the mast is straight, which can be done just by looking at it. If there are any obvious bends or little kinks or something in it, then you want to walk away. And you want to inspect all the fittings on the mast to make sure they're in good shape. And we'll go up on deck in a second and take a look at a few other fittings that you want to be aware of after we look at some things down here in the boat. Now, another thing is the base of the mast, the bottom of the mast. On a deck step mast, it's going to fit into some sort of fitting on top of the cabin house or on the deck. And usually that fitting will have a drain so water can't accumulate in there. And if the mast is up, you're going to want to look into that fitting as best you can to see if the base of the mast is corroded. Most common spot on a mast to have significant corrosion is the base of the mast, where it sits possibly in a wet environment for long periods of time. And a corroded mast base may require modifying the mast by cutting off the corroded part, maybe putting a little piece of aluminum on there to replace it. And corrosion of the mast step or the mast foot is also very common in keel step masts, because the keel, of course, is on the bottom of the boat, right down in the bilge where you're likely to have water, and keel step mast bases tend to be wet, and you want to examine the base of a keel step mast very carefully, because it may be pretty badly corroded, and it may be something that you either have to cut off the base of the mast and maybe build up the mast step where the keel step mast sits to compensate for the material you cut off, or get a little piece of that section of mast and add it on after you cut a bad piece off. So that can be time consuming and expensive, so it's worth taking a look at the foot of the mast to see what condition it's in. Now, the other really critical component in the standing rig is the attachment points for the rigging wires to the boat. And those are called chain plates, although we don't attach chains to them, but they're called chain plates. And they are pieces of either stainless steel, or on some boats bronze flat bar that are, depending on the design of the boat, may be bolted to the outside of the boat, or they may pass through the deck and be bolted to an interior feature inside the boat, such as a bulkhead or a knee. So let's go take a look at the inside attachment point of one of the chain plates on this boat, my Allied Princess 36 Catch. Okay, this is the bottom of the chain plate on my forward lower shroud on the starboard side. You can see it is a piece of stainless steel flat bar. It's bolted through this bulkhead to a backing plate on the other side of the bulkhead. And that is what holds the shroud down. And that's a sort of typical, relatively light duty chain plate. And this boat has 6 chain plates for the shrouds, and it has an attachment point on the stem fitting at the bow for the forestay, and attachment points back aft for the backstay. So chain plates are important because they can get corroded if they're chain plates that pass through the deck. They, in particular, right where they pass through the deck, they can get corroded. And because if you have any leaks that pass through in the deck, is a spot where it will probably be damp. And stainless steel doesn't like to be continuously damp, particularly in a closed space where there's no free oxygen. So you can get significant corrosion in a chain plate, which may look great above deck and below deck, but basically be almost corroded through where it passes through the deck. And so one of the things you might want to do, particularly if the mast is down, is inspect the chain plates. Now, you probably won't be able to get permission to actually remove any of them during survey, and a surveyor probably won't do it. But once you buy the boat, you probably want to take them out and inspect them. They're just bolted in on most boats, not all, but most, and see what condition they're in. If they look at all sketchy, you want to do one of two things: either just replace them, or do dye penetration testing on them to see if there are any little cracks. They're not usually that expensive. I think this bar stock costs, $4 or $5 a foot. And to replace all the chain plates on this boat for the shrouds would probably cost $70, $80, $90, maybe $100 if you had your own drill press and could drill the holes. So, and of course you'd want to replace the bolts as well, and inspect the bulkheads or knees that they pass through for any signs of rot if the connection points are made out of wood. So let's go up on deck and take a look at some of the other things you want to be aware of. Well, here we are up on deck. This is the cap shroud for the port side for my main mast. Comes down, the wire comes down, and it goes into this eye fitting. This is a swaged on eye. And then that is attached through this toggle to a turnbuckle. There's another toggle, and then it goes down to, and yet another toggle in this case, to a chain plate. This is the top or above deck part of a chain plate, and you can see I've got that sealed down here, and I've used butyl rubber to seal it because it stays flexible and provides a very good seal. Some of the things you want to look at here are, obviously the condition of each of these components, because if anything here breaks, your mast is going to fall over, which is not good. So you want to inspect these. One thing about turnbuckles like this is a chrome plated turnbuckle. The body of a turnbuckle like this is almost always made out of silicon bronze. And the threaded parts here and here are usually made out of stainless steel, 316 stainless in this case. And that's on purpose, because if this whole thing was stainless steel, the threads here and the threads inside the body of the turnbuckle tend to weld together and can seize up. That doesn't happen if you have bronze and stainless steel. But you can get a little bit of crevice or of galvanic corrosion in there, so you want to make sure that these are washed down with fresh water frequently and kept clean. These pins here, clevis pins that go through, are another possible failure point. You want to make sure they're in good shape and make sure they all have good cotter pins in them that are properly secured. Now, a lot of people tape over these. I don't, because I prefer to be able to see them. And same down here and down here. So that is a typical setup for attaching a shroud to the chain plate. And the turnbuckle is there to adjust the tension on the shroud. And by adjusting both sides, you can make sure the mast is straight up and down, that it isn't tilted to one side or another, and that the tension is the same on both of the shrouds. Now here's one of my lowers, the shroud and the turnbuckle, and down here the chain plate. Basically the same, but this is a much older turnbuckle. This isn't corrosion, this is where the chrome plating on the bronze body of the turnbuckle is wearing off. But this turnbuckle is perfectly sound and in good condition. And it doesn't have to, and if you're not interested in having it look pretty, as long as it's sound, that's all you need. And particularly because these turnbuckles, the cheapest you can find them for this size turnbuckle, which is a 1/2 inch pin and 1/2 inch threads, is about $120. There are 9 of them on this boat, so you're looking at over $1,000 if you had to replace all of these big turnbuckles. Now let's take a look at the mast and look at some other things you want to look at. Now here we are on the cabin top, and there's the mast going down into the mast step. This is a deck step mast. See, it fits into that stainless steel fitting there, and there are drain holes in the bottom of that so that any water that gets in there can drain out. And I take this mast down every year and the bottom of the mast is not corroded. Now there are a number of fittings on here. I don't have the main boom on right now. This is its attachment point, so you want to inspect fittings like this to make sure they're in good shape. Now this one's fine. It doesn't look very pretty, but there's nothing wrong with it. And another thing you're going to find on almost every mast is winches, and these are what are called halyard winches. This is a halyard. This is the jib halyard, which is used to pull the jib up. This is the main halyard, which is used to pull the main up. So you want to make sure these winches are functional, in good shape. They're not jammed up, they're not corroded, and they work properly. Now I had an issue with this one last year, and that this screw that's right inside there fell out, and the drum here on the winch almost fell off the boat. It had slid out about 2 inches, and that is not good. So you want to look at the winches, see what condition they're in. Now these are old standard winches. This is one of my old main sheet winches. This is a Variant 22 winch, which is way overkill for a main halyard winch. But you might, on some boats, want to put if you're going to have mast mounted winches, you might want to consider putting a self-tailing winch there, which is going to cost you probably $700 to $800. And there are other fittings on the mast. Obviously there are cleats to tie lines off to, make sure they're in good shape. And depending on your mast, you may have something like this. This is a track for mounting a spinnaker pole. This boat doesn't have a spinnaker pole, but that's where it would mount, and it can be moved up and down. And you also want to investigate the condition of the spreaders, which are up there. If it's a single spreader rig, they're about halfway up the mast. If it's a double, they're spaced about 1/3 and 2/3 of the way up the mast, and so on. So those are the main things you want to be aware of on a mast in terms of the mast itself and its standing rigging. Okay, that pretty much covers what I wanted to say about the mast and the standing rigging and things you need to look for when you're looking at an old fiberglass sailboat that you're thinking of buying. Some of the things you'll be able to check before you buy the boat, and some you probably won't be able to check until after you buy the boat. But you should be prepared, particularly if you're planning to take the boat offshore, to do things like replace all of the chain plates. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this little look at the mast and standing rigging. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't, why don't you consider subscribing to my channel? Thanks for watching.